Hello, this is Jane, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the August 27 issue of the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And I'm going to start on the front page where the main headline reads, Everyone's heart is broken. At least 160 killed, 24 Canadians among hundreds missing after flash floods on Nepal-China border. And this is by Estella Wren. Members of Toronto's Nepali Canadian community have been unable to reach family members living in affected areas after flash floods tore through the Nepal-China border region Wednesday, killing at least 160 people and leaving hundreds missing, while power and telecommunication infrastructure have been severely damaged. Among the missing residents, tourists, and workers are 24 Canadians. Travel in areas across the region has been halted in the wake of the disaster that experts said was likely caused by an avalanche from a melting glacier. Sudarshan Sepkoda, president of Nepalese Canadian Community Services, said the flooding struck around 9 a.m. local time, close to midnight Tuesday in Toronto. He did not learn about the disaster until he woke up around 5 a.m. and saw the news. I just switched on my phone and saw all those pictures and videos, and that makes me sad and devastated, Sepkoda said. Everyone's heart is broken. The tragedy is not limited to the local residents. The people are traveling there for work, business, and tourism, he said. In Nepal's hard-hit Nuwakot district, floodwaters coated buildings in thick mud, buried vehicles, and left debris tangled in trees and utility wires. Images from the area showed mud-covered survivors surveying the destruction, while aerial footage revealed washed-out roads and buildings engulfed by the muddy torrent. Nepalese officials said 403 people remain missing, including 341 foreign nationals. Among them are 133 Indian pilgrims traveling to Mount Kailash in Tibet, a sacred site for Hindus, as well as 47 Americans, 34 Australians, 33 Britons, and the 24 from Canada. The U.S. Geological Survey initially recorded a magnitude 4.4 earthquake about 66 kilometers north of Kathmandu early Wednesday near the Nepal-China border, but later reclassified the event as a magnitude 5.2 landslide. Sepkoda said he had no additional information beyond what has been publicly disclosed about the Canadians reported missing. The main areas affected by the flash flooding lie along the Botakoshi and Trishuli River corridors, Sepkoda said. He identified Rasuwa district, particularly Rasuwagadi and Timur, as among the hardest hit areas. Flooding also affected people traveling to Gosaikunda, a sacred pilgrimage site that draws many visitors at this time of year, he said. Rojina Dungana, 28, who works in Ottawa, said the flood swept through her hometown of Trishuli, but her parents' home was spared because it sits on higher ground. But most of the relatives and other people from our community, they are missing, said Dungana. I found it extremely devastating and heartbreaking. From the video she has seen, the school and playground where she grew up have been swallowed by the river, and many families in the community have lost everything, their homes, land, and livestock, she said. Dungana has been unable to speak directly with her parents. She pleaded with governments and Canadians to support Nepal with immediate relief, including solar chargers and emergency communication equipment, and to help the country rebuild roads and other critical infrastructure after the floodwaters recede. In a post on X, Prime Minister Mark Carney called the flash floods along Nepal's Botakoshi River absolutely devastating. He said the government is closely following the situation and urged all Canadians in the region to register with the Registration of Canadians Abroad system as soon as possible. Canadians are thinking of all those in distress right now, those who have lost a loved one, and all those who are still waiting for answers, wrote Carney. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand said Global Affairs Canada consular officials are in contact with local authorities and are prepared to assist Canadians in the region. According to Global Affairs Canada, 820 Canadians were registered as being in Nepal and 5 in the Tibet Autonomous Region of China as of August 26. But the department cautioned those figures may not reflect the actual number of Canadians living in or visiting the affected areas. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi said he spoke with Nepalese Prime Minister Balendra Shah and offered humanitarian assistance, adding that Indian teams were coordinating with Nepal on rescue and relief efforts. Some United Nations agencies were also mobilizing to respond to significant humanitarian needs. Nepal's Himalayan communities have faced a number of flash floods in recent years, including floods triggered by glacial lake outbursts and intense monsoon rainfall. But Wednesday's disaster was among the most severe, said Brian Menounos, a research professor in the geography program at the University of Northern British Columbia. Preliminary evidence suggests a large section of a glacier in high mountain Asia detached and plunged roughly 1,000 meters into the valley, Menounos said. Climate experts at the Kathmandu-based International Center for Integrated Mountain Development noted the exceptional speed and magnitude of the flood wave, with river waters rising up to 9 meters over 30 minutes. The collapse may also have temporarily dammed the river, allowing water to build up behind the unstable blockage before eventually breaking through and rushing downstream, Menounos added. However, he cautioned that it is still too early to determine the exact cause and sequence of events. There's undoubtedly a component of climate change playing an important role here, he said. That is how quickly the glaciers are disappearing from high mountain Asia. The next article is also on the front page. It's from the byline Trade. Western premiers against potash oil tariffs. Moe and Smith say natural resources not a bargaining chip. And this is by Stephanie Taylor. Ottawa. As Canada prepares to return the economic pain inflicted by new U.S. tariffs, 2 Western premiers pushed back against calls to turn the region's potash and oil into tools of retaliation. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe said he supports the dollar-for-dollar countermeasures announced by Prime Minister Mark Carney, but the goal must be to get back to the negotiating table with U.S. President Donald Trump after trade talks collapsed last Friday. What we as a province cannot and will not support is any kind of export tariff on our natural resources or any of our resources that are being exported to the U.S. or through the U.S. to other areas of the world, Moe said at a news conference on Wednesday in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. Moe also said his province will impose a 50% reciprocal tax on American alcohol starting September 8 in response to the U.S. applying 50% tariffs on $28 billion worth of Canadian booze and other goods. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith also pushed back hard against the assertion that oil flowing to the U.S. should be hit with export tariffs, saying the Americans could in turn slap their own levies on the oil, natural gas, and diesel they export to Ontario and Quebec. The Premier's stance against putting natural resources on the retaliation table showed a fault line in the Team Canada approach Carney and the Premiers have tried to keep in the face of Trump's new tariffs. Most comments came after Ontario Premier Doug Ford earlier in the day raised the specter of choking the supply of potash to the U.S., a key fertilizer ingredient, as a reaction to Trump saying Canada does not have, quote, anything, unquote, his country needs. If we ever cut out that potash, their agricultural sector would be dead overnight, absolutely dead, Ford told reporters in Vaughan. That is one of the most powerful tools we have. Former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney told the Canadian press on Tuesday that measures such as putting export taxes on resources like oil and potash ought to be on the table. That would affect Republicans who drive F-150s and lay fertilizer on their farm fields, Kenney said. NDP leader Avi Lewis also said in a statement that Canada ought to hit Trump where it hurts when it comes to the commodities the U.S. relies on, saying on X that resources like oil, gas, thermal coal, potash, and other minerals should be taxed. Call it playing our Trump card, he wrote. Mo listed ramifications like potential job losses and higher prices. He also pointed to past policy decisions that he says have limited where and how Western provinces can get their products to market. He pointed to Canada's lack of refining capacity for heavy crude and the fierce opposition proponents of the since-abandoned Energy East pipeline faced when it came to the proposed route of sending oil from Saskatchewan and Alberta to Quebec and New Brunswick. All too often, those very same individuals that are promoting export tariffs on a product like oil 10 years ago were the very same individuals standing up and saying we should not build important energy security infrastructure like the Energy East pipeline, Mo said. Smith, speaking from Grande Prairie, Alberta, also warned of potential job losses and the economic pain that could bring those provinces, as well as to the Canadian economy as a whole. She said another risk is the U.S. could turn away from Canadian oil and look more to countries like Venezuela. Although I understand the need to respond strongly to these tariffs, I cannot think of a more disastrous policy decision than cutting off or taxing Alberta's oil to the United States, Smith said. On Wednesday morning, Trump spoke to an American conservative commentator about the collapse of the Canada-U.S. trade talks, saying he had offered what he believed to be a pretty good deal. He also repeated his concerns about Canada taking, quote, advantage, unquote, of the U.S. They don't have anything that we have to have, Trump said. We can get by. I mean, there are a couple of things that would make it a little inconvenient, but we can get them elsewhere. It's time to teach Canada you can't do this anymore, he added. Ford pushed back against Trump's comments, pointing to the millions of barrels of oil Canada sends to the U.S., as well as its supply of potash. What would happen if Scott Moe decided, okay, I'm rerouting the potash? 90% goes down to the U.S., Ford said. Everyone in the world wants our potash, Ford added, so the president has a choice. Either be fair to us or deal with Russia. Get your potash off Russia. See how well they trade it. The U.S. has so far excluded potash and oil from its tariffs on Canadian goods. Meaux, whose province is home to Canada's potash mines and uses U.S. ports to ship the product globally, said Canada would risk losing a long-term customer in the U.S. if it were to impose any export tariffs, and the Americans could instead look to smaller potash-producing nations like Belarus. This would be a tremendously flawed policy on the behalf of Canadians. The American Farm Bureau Federation, which represents U.S. farmers, warned the Trump administration at the onset of the Canada-U.S. trade war early last year that 85% of the potash used by American farmers for fertilizer comes from Canada. United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, who had been leading the negotiations for the Trump administration, in a rare interview with CBC News, warned on Wednesday that should Canada retaliate, we're not going to just sit down and take that. Trump's trade advisor, Peter Navarro, also pushed back against both Carney and Ford, saying he believes the Prime Minister sees his political fortunes rise for trashing Donald Trump, while his economy takes a hit. Navarro also referred to Ford as the Prime Minister's German shepherd, who keeps egging him on, saying the pair failed to understand that because the U.S. has the bigger of the two economies, they need us more than we need them. And before I go on, I need to remind you that you are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And I have one more article from the front page, and this one's under the byline of 20 years in isolation. Use of seclusion similar to torture. And this is from a report. Hospital at center of Star investigation categorically rejects review's findings. And this is by Jacques Gallant. Ontario's only maximum security psychiatric hospital is locking patients up for years at a time in conditions akin to those the United Nations has deemed to constitute torture, concludes a damning independent report. The 109-page report by Andrea Monteiro, who previously served in senior roles in the correctional system, paints a stark portrait of the use of seclusion at Waypoint Center for Mental Health Care, which has been the subject of an ongoing Star investigation and described by leading experts as unlike anything seen in other North American hospitals. It notes, among other findings, that the daily orders that keep seriously mentally ill patients in isolation appear perfunctory, don't always provide a rationale, and are made without an in-person assessment. Staff tasked with checking on patients' well-being every 15 minutes do little more than look into rooms. A lack of staff means patients can go an entire day without any time out of their room. Monteiro's report is the most detailed look inside Waypoint, located on Georgian Bay in the Penetanguishene since the release of the Stars series earlier this year. Her assessment focuses on the case of 39-year-old Andrew Azevedo, a man living with treatment-resistant schizophrenia, who, after being held in continuous isolation for almost 5 years, is suddenly on the cusp of being released from seclusion. An improvement his doctor maintains had nothing to do with Monteiro's report. Contrary to its policy, Waypoint appears to be using seclusion not as an option of last resort to deal with a patient who poses an immediate risk of serious bodily harm to themselves or others, but to preemptively manage those who might become violent, Montero concluded. It's a practice, Montero said, that is now prohibited in many jails and prisons, despite housing some of the most dangerous people, many with serious mental illnesses. The shift away from isolation stems from the recognition in psychiatry, psychology, and the courts that keeping people locked up alone for long periods of time is harmful, especially when the individual experiencing the isolation has a serious mental illness, Montero said. One of her primary conclusions is that seclusion falls under the UN's standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners. The Mandela rules say that 22 hours or more a day in confinement without meaningful human interaction amounts to solitary confinement. Montero noted the international legal community has repeatedly found that solitary confinement longer than 15 days can constitute torture. It's a finding that Waypoint categorically disagrees with, saying there's a significant difference between seclusion in a hospital and solitary confinement in a prison. But Montero found that the Mandela rules apply regardless of where the person is detained. And there's a little byline here that says you can't turn a blind eye. Psychiatrists, including those working at Waypoint, agree that seclusion should be used for as brief a time as possible. But this has not stopped Waypoint's practice of keeping some patients in isolation for months, years, and even decades, in the case of Camelot Hamblett, a man at the center of the Starr investigation, 20 years in isolation. Montero's report was made public last week during Azevedo's Ontario Review Board, that's ORB, hearing. The board, made up of retired judges, lawyers, doctors, and laypersons, decides whether individuals found not criminally responsible or unfit to stand trial should remain detained in hospital. Azevedo has been at Waypoint since 2021 and was found unfit to stand trial for allegedly assaulting a psychiatrist at the hospital the following year. According to his medical records, the doctor was dealing with another patient when Azevedo suddenly grabbed and possibly struck him in the Waypoint admissions unit. No injuries were reported, but the psychiatrist nonetheless filed a police report. According to the OPP, the doctor reasoned that if Azevedo were charged, he could find a more permanent home and treatment plan on the forensic unit at Waypoint. He's been kept in seclusion ever since, due to persistent, aggressive behavior caused by his hallucinations. Montero, the former director of corrections in the Yukon, who previously worked for 15 years in senior roles with what is now Ontario's Ministry of the Solicitor General, had been tasked by the ORB with developing recommendations to get Azevedo out of seclusion. She visited the hospital twice this year, interviewing staff, reviewing Waypoint's policies, consulting Azevedo's 53,000-page clinical file, and speaking with him and his family. Montero offered wide-ranging recommendations, but stressed that a more robust, independent assessment of the hospital's use of seclusion is warranted, given that her mandate was to focus solely on Azevedo. The overuse or misuse of seclusion is often a symptom of other system-wide issues that require redress, Montero wrote. She recommended that Waypoint work with other hospitals and the Ministry of Health to amend the Mental Health Act to create a clear legal definition of seclusion and public reporting obligations when seclusion is used. Waypoint should also work with an external advisor to create a comprehensive policy on seclusion that aligns with the spirit of the United Nations rules on solitary confinement. She further recommended a comprehensive review of the staffing levels on Azevedo's unit, prioritizing more recreational therapy programs on the unit and hospital-specific training on seclusion that should be mandatory for everyone working at Waypoint, from frontline staff to executives. Waypoint CEO Dr. Nadia Sundarji has been criticized for not involving herself in the day-to-day use of seclusion, while at the same time saying she's committed to the implementation of the international best practices to reduce seclusion, known as the 6 core strategies. The first of those strategies is that the CEO be involved in daily seclusion decisions. Azevedo's lawyer, Anita Zaghetti, agreed that her client remains unfit to stand trial and should remain detained at Waypoint, but not in seclusion. She urged the ORB to order the hospital to adopt many of Montero's recommendations, asking them to keep in mind there are other patients in similar situations. There are at least 11 patients currently secluded just on Azevedo's 20-bed unit, she told the 5-member panel. You can't turn a blind eye to that. Waypoint has consistently refused to divulge the number of patients in long-term seclusion throughout the facility. The hospital agreed with Zaghetti's request earlier this year for Montero's independent assessment. Zaghetti believed that a Court of Appeal decision in January ordering an independent assessment for Hamblett, coupled with the Star's ongoing coverage of seclusion at Waypoint, were what persuaded the hospital to agree. For its part, Waypoint asked that the board not order it to do anything further. The hospital says it has already integrated Ms. Montero's recommendations into Mr. Azevedo's care plan, where appropriate. Waypoint is dedicated to upholding the dignity and rights of every patient in its care and to fulfilling its responsibility to provide a safe and secure therapeutic environment. Azevedo's treating psychiatrist, Dr. Ashal Mishra, described Montero's report as, quote, good reading, unquote, but said she had made a very broad generalizations. In any event, Mishra told the board his patient is set to be released from seclusion in the next few days, thanks to changes to his medication. Changes Mishra said had nothing to do with the Montero report or the Star's coverage. Waypoint's lawyer, Julia Lefobes, told the board that Montero comes with a corrections perspective that isn't necessarily applicable to a forensic hospital, and that some of the recommendations were beyond the scope of what the board can order. Montero's report was entered as an exhibit after Waypoint unsuccessfully tried to have information about staffing levels redacted due to security risks. Zaghetti had argued for the full document to be released, noting that in the wake of the media coverage, the general public is acutely aware of alarm bells ringing and has a pressing interest in the right to know what is being done with seriously mentally ill people in seclusion at Waypoint. The ORB will issue its decision on the recommendations at a later date. And there's a byline over the next paragraph that says UN's definition of solitary confinement. While Montero said she could find no Waypoint policy that defined long-term seclusion, Staff told her it was 60 days or more of continuous seclusion. In my opinion, if Waypoint patients are denied free movement and association with others, are deprived of meaningful human interaction, rely on others for the provision of basic care, and are confined for 22 or more hours per day in their room, they are living in conditions that amount to the United Nations definition of solitary confinement, Monteiro wrote. The fact that the practice is taking place in a hospital does not change the reality that the individual is secluded for 22 hours or more a day with little meaningful human interaction. Sunderji, Waypoint CEO, rejected Monteiro's findings in a statement. We categorically disagree that a mental health care hospital is similar to a correctional setting, Sunderji said. We categorically disagree with Ms. Monteiro's characterization of the conditions experienced by patients in seclusion at Waypoint. She said that in seclusion, patients continue to have access to mental health treatment, therapeutic supports, entertainment, and visits from loved ones. Monteiro's report noted staff have never seen either the director of Azevedo's unit or other hospital executives participate in reviews regarding a patient's ongoing seclusion. In my opinion, the director and hospital executives are ultimately also responsible for the continued use of seclusion at Waypoint, Monteiro wrote. I didn't realize the article was this long, so I need to pause real quick just to remind you you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And now back to the article on the use of seclusion at Waypoint. They should be aware of and actively involved in decisions that severely restrict the liberty of their patients, especially those who are being held in conditions that the United Nations have deemed to constitute torture in similar environmental settings. Monteiro's report includes a comprehensive rundown of the day-to-day practices that have kept Azevedo locked up alone for years. An order maintaining a patient's seclusion is made daily by a physician after reviewing their file and speaking to their care team about the patient's behavior over the past 24 hours, she explained. However, an in-person assessment is only required after the first day in isolation, but not each subsequent day, Monteiro found, meaning Azevedo's seclusion has been maintained daily for years without a doctor being required to assess him. In looking at his clinical file, Monteiro found daily entries from seclusion rounds that offer no rationale for ordering Azevedo's isolation to continue, nor any mention of other strategies to try to get him out of seclusion. Monteiro pointed out there were days when Azevedo's seclusion was maintained even though no aggressive incidents had been reported in the previous 24 hours. One employee regularly involved in his care indicated that they didn't believe Azevedo posed the current security risk response that he was currently subjected to, Monteiro wrote. Okay, this article is very, very long, goes on several pages. So what I'm going to do is, there's other articles I'd like to read. I'm going to skip to a new article. You can call 716-821-5555 if you want to hear the rest of this. I will end with the last paragraph that says, my opinion is that she was uniquely situated to do that analysis, and she's speaking about Monteiro. Ultimately, it's an invaluable resource that I would hope Waypoint takes very seriously and reflects upon, and that was said by the lawyer Zaghetti. Okay, the next article is Boy Dies After Being Struck by GO Train in East End, and this is by Gabriel Hilty. A teen boy has died after being hit by a GO train in Toronto's East End on Tuesday night. Officers were called to the area of Monarch Park at 10:20 p.m. on Tuesday for reports that a person had been struck by a train, Toronto police said. A Metrolinx spokesperson said it occurred along the Lakeshore East line. The park is immediately north of multiple tracks used by trains, including GO Transit and Via Rail. An official who was not authorized to speak publicly said the boy and a girl were walking along the tracks when two trains approached. The official said the teen dodged the first train but was fatally hit by the second. Police confirmed in an email that one person was pronounced dead at the scene. The girl who was with him was uninjured. These events are always incredibly difficult for everyone involved, and our thoughts are with the family and loved ones of this individual and with our employees and first responders that were affected by this event, the Metrolinx statement said. An investigation is ongoing. The next article is titled World Leading Researchers Set to Arrive in Canada. Ottawa's $1 billion research chair program puts 64 scientists in positions at schools here. This is by Ryan Tumulty. AI researchers, Ivy League professors, and at least one winner of the MacArthur Genius Grant will move to Canada from the U.S. with funds from the federal government's Research Chair Program. Industry Minister Melanie Joly will announce Thursday, the Star has learned. At a news conference in Vancouver on Thursday, Joly will announce that 64 professors will be coming to Canada under the Eddie Goldenberg Research Chairs of Canada program. The government announced the $1 billion program last December to attract world-leading researchers with work that can be commercialized. Joly said it's about getting top talent to Canadian schools. We have one of the biggest, if not the biggest, budgets in the Western world to attract talent. For a long time, we've been dealing with the impacts of brain drain. We're now in brain game mode, she said ahead of the announcement. The program was named after Goldenberg, a former chief of staff to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, who the funding will pay not only for professors' salaries, but also labs and staff. Joly said it has the potential to have a huge knock-on economic effect. We will be able to position our universities as great magnets of talent, and we will be able not only to attract the different chairs that I'm talking about, the great scientists, but they will also be coming up with their labs, with their teams, with their families, and so that will change the lives of thousands of people across Canada, she said. This first round of the program is awarding $541 million for the research chairs, with another intake expected in about 6 months. The University of British Columbia will receive most of the new chairs, with 9 positions, followed by the University of Ottawa with 7, and the University of Toronto and McGill University, which are both bringing in 6 of the positions. Other Ontario universities to attract talent include McMaster with 5 positions, Waterloo with 3, and Trent, Western, and Guelph, Queen's, and Toronto Metropolitan University, which will all receive 1 of the chairs. According to the government's data on the 64 new positions, 48 are researchers that are coming from American institutions, including researchers at Harvard, Yale, Duke, Cornell, and MIT. The researchers are also coming from institutions in Europe and Asia, and 22 of the 64 are expat Canadians returning home. The Trump administration has sued or launched investigations into several Ivy League schools, freezing funding in many cases over the treatment of anti-Semitism on the campus, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and in international students. Joly said the universities took the opportunity of the new funding and brought in researchers with impressive resumes. The universities have been fantastic. They've really gotten involved in attracting these talents, she said. The University of Toronto's chairs include Adrienne Campbell Washburn, an investigator at the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Joy Jiang from Washington University, who works on AI tools for healthcare and has launched several companies, Tanya Berger-Wolf, who studies AI for biodiversity, Michelle Arkin, a pharmaceutical researcher at the University of California, and Raymond Fissman, a behavioral economist from Boston University. The University of Toronto has already announced that Sarah Seeger, an astrophysicist from MIT, is joining the school. She will be receiving one of the research chairs announced on Thursday. Seeger studies exoplanets and has been a senior researcher on several NASA missions, as well as having been awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant for her work. The next article is titled PM was invited in May. Oops, sorry, I didn't get the whole thing. The whole headline reads, Carney to address EU Parliament. PM was invited in May prior to trade upheaval with U.S., and this is by Alan Woods. Prime Minister Mark Carney will address the European Parliament and be a guest of honor at the European Union's State of the Union address next month. Carney received the invitation in May to speak to Europe's legislative body in Strasbourg, France, but the timing is politically fortuitous, given the heightened trade tension with the United States and after the breakdown of talks last week aimed at reducing American tariffs on Canadian exports. Prime Minister Carney was pleased to accept European Parliament President Roberta Metsola invitation to address the European Parliament, the Prime Minister's office said in a statement Wednesday. On the margins of his address, the Prime Minister will also attend the European Union's annual State of the Union address by the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Paula Pinho, chief spokesperson for the European Commission, said von der Leyen invited Carney to attend her annual address to the European Parliament this year, before tensions between Canada and U.S. spiked. This invitation was meant as a sign of the close relations between the European Union and Canada, and to signal our common ambition to upgrade our partnership, Pinho said in an email. At a shipbuilding announcement Monday in Quebec, Carney said Canada was set to begin intense discussions with the EU to build a much stronger and deeper economic and security partnership. That is believed to be a reference to the annual Canada European Union Summit, which is scheduled for October. Since coming to power in 2025, Carney has been attempting to reorient the Canadian economy away from its reliance on U.S.-bound exports and has focused his efforts on building closer ties to Europe. Canada and the EU, that's European Union, signed a security and defense partnership agreement in 2025. Carney was invited to address the European Political Communities Summit in May, an occasion he used to share his prediction that the international order he declared dead and gone in a January speech at Davos would be rebuilt out of Europe. This summer, Carney secured Canada's participation in an EU defense procurement initiative known as Security Action for Europe, that's SAFE or SAFE, that provides countries with access to $243 billion worth of low-interest loans. And before I read the next article, I just want to remind you that you're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And the next article is titled, Man Cleared in Death at Jane Station. Judge finds Crown failed to disprove self-defense claim in fatal 2024 stabbing of father of 7. And this is by Jacques Gallant. A smiling Tifai Opoku Baudu walked out of the courthouse on Wednesday after a judge acquitted him of murdering a father of 7 at Jane Station in 2024, finding that the 24-year-old accused was acting in self-defense. feeling good, just got acquitted, Opoku Baudu said to reporters as he left the Superior Court of Justice. The truth came to light. Opoku Baudu was accused of second-degree murder in the stabbing death of 39-year-old Matthew Rumble, a complete stranger, on June 25, 2024, after both got off a bus at the subway station. There was no dispute that Opoku Baudu fatally stabbed Rumble with a knife more than 12 inches in length. The question that Superior Court Justice Jennifer Penman had to resolve at the judge-alone trial this summer was, whose knife was it? Defense lawyer Karen Symes contended that the knife belonged to Rumble, pointing out he worked as a cook. She argued that Rumble was the aggressor, that he awaited for Opoku Baudu to get off at the station after the two exchanged words on the bus, likely over Opoku Baudu's excessive spraying of cologne, as seen on surveillance footage. It's unknown what the two said to each other. Symes argued that Rumble physically attacked Opoku Baudu as he got off the bus and pulled the knife out of his cross-body bag. She showed photos at trial demonstrating that the knife could fit inside the bag. She said her client, who did not testify, was able to wrestle the knife away and stab Rumble, including a fatal wound to the chest. Crown attorney Levi Karadmir argued that the knife belonged to Opoku Baudu, that he was angry about what had happened on the bus, and that the multiple stab wounds inflicted on Rumble, including injuries to the head and chin area, would suggest Opoku Baudu was in dominant control of the weapon during the fight. In her decision delivered Wednesday in front of Rumble's widow Stella and a few of their children, Penman noted that Opoku Baudu's offensive and inappropriate conduct of spraying the cologne on the bus while seated near Rumble is what started the altercation. In my view, he was being a troublemaker, she said, but she found that he didn't foresee he would engage in a physical fight as a result. I would say it is more likely than not that Mr. Rumble brought the knife to the fight, Penman said after reviewing the defense's arguments. She went on to conclude that the Crown had failed to disprove that Opoku Baudu was acting in self-defense. She found that Rumble was seeking out a confrontation with the accused, pointing to surveillance footage showing Rumble waiting outside for Opoku Baudu to get off the bus. Opoku Baudu and his companion were the last to get off. When Opoku Baudu did get off, Rumble aggressively circled him and struck him in the face with his elbow, and the two soon ended up fighting on the ground. I am not persuaded that in those final few seconds that Mr. Opoku Baudu was aware of anything other than trying to get Mr. Rumble off him and prevent Mr. Rumble from getting the knife, Penman said. I have carefully considered Mr. Opoku Baudu's actions that day, and I accept that he was acting for the purpose of defending himself and preventing Mr. Rumble from using the knife against him. She didn't accept that Opoku Baudu was aiming at Rumble's chest, as opposed to reacting in the moment to the violent struggle that he unexpectedly found himself in. Penman concluded that Opoku Baudu had a reasonable belief that the knife would be used against him. After stabbing Rumble, Opoku Baudu fled the scene, throwing the knife away in a parking lot. He was arrested a few days later in Waterloo. Penman said her verdict shouldn't be understood as condoning or excusing Opoku Baudu's conduct that day. She also addressed Rumble's family directly. I also recognize the disappointment and frustration you must feel with the verdict, she said. I want you to know that the verdict is not a reflection of the value of your loved one. The next article is titled Immigration Appeal Hinges on the Use of Cutting and Pasting. Refugee argues second rejection too similar to first. And this is by Nicholas Keong. How much cutting and pasting is okay? That's the question before the federal court in a legal challenge involving an Afghan refugee in limbo in Turkey whose resettlement application has twice been rejected by Canadian immigration officials. Specifically, if an immigration officer copies and pastes a chunk of a colleague's work, almost word for word, in refusing the same applicant, does that meet the bar of a fresh and independent analysis required for a case under reconsideration? In asking the court to quash the latest refusal, lawyers for Atakula Lally said 70% of the analysis to justify the decision consists of copied and pasted material from the reasons for the first refusal. The near verbatim reuse of the analysis gave rise to a reasonable apprehension of bias that the reviewing officer was predisposed to refuse the application. Lally's co-counsel Andrew Colton told the court in a hearing Wednesday. Rather than stepping back and independently reviewing the evidence, he argued that the officer simply tried to bootstrap and improve upon the refusal reasons in his client's case. Lally, 30, said he fled from Afghanistan to Turkey in August 2021 to escape persecution by the Taliban, which threatened to forcibly recruit him as punishment for the women's rights activism of his father and sister. For more than 2 years, he lived in Istanbul as an undocumented migrant while awaiting the processing of his resettlement to Canada. He was arrested by Turkish police in 2024 due to a lack of immigration status and is currently subject to an enforceable Turkish deportation order to send him back to Afghanistan. The refugee sponsorship application submitted in June 2022 by his aunt in Brampton was first refused in May 2024 because Lally did not provide the refugee status determination document issued by the Turkish government or the United Nations Refugee Agency that certified him as a refugee. Lally had requested exemption from that requirement because Turkey doesn't allow the UN agency to provide refugee certificates in the country, and the regime's hostile treatment of single male Afghan asylum seekers would put him at risk of detention and deportation to Afghanistan if he came forward. According to court submissions, the officer rejected his request. Lally and his sponsors appealed the refusal to the federal court, which in March 2025 quashed the officer's decision and sent the case back for reconsideration by a different officer. The application was refused again a month later, and another court challenge followed. At Wednesday's hearing, government lawyer Hillary Adams pointed out that the court sent the case back for reconsideration last year because the original court records were missing 600 to 700 pages of documents. Since the first judge never reviewed the substance of the initial refusal, there should be no issue replicating the refusal reasons, she told Judge Darren R. Thorne. The refusal reasons are largely similar, and there's no problem with that. Adams said when an officer is faced with almost exactly the same submissions under the same legislative and policy constraints, there will be very similar reasons, if not the same reasons. The editing and additions in the new refusal, no matter how small, suggested there's thoughtful consideration in the assessment, she added. The fact that there's redundancy or copying or similarity does not rise to the level of a reasonable apprehension of bias, she argued. The judge then questioned if one could conclude that the reviewing officer did give a fresh assessment of the case as required, with the large swaths of the decision essentially being the same. In response, Adams reiterated that there would be obvious similarity in the analysis because officers were bound by the rules and the law that they must apply. Lally has asked the court to quash his resettlement refusal and order immigration officials to exempt him from the refugee certificate requirement and reconsider the application. The judge reserved his decision. And quickly, I can fit one more in. Police say same car was used in 3 shootings, and this is under the byline of crime, and it's by Simon McCune. Toronto police said that they believe the same car was used in 3 shootings at busy residential complexes early Sunday and Wednesday in East York. On Wednesday, officers responded to 43 Thorncliffe Park Drive to reports of gunfire in the area around 2:30 a.m., according to a news release. On Sunday, officers also responded to similar reports at 47 and 49 Thorncliffe Park Drive at about 4 a.m. No injuries were reported at any of the 3 shootings, police said. At the scene on Wednesday, investigators said they found evidence of shots fired and a dark-colored sedan fleeing the area. Authorities said they believe it was a black 2016 to 2020 Honda Civic with tinted windows and no front license plate, according to the news release. The rear license plate was not identified. Investigators are now working to determine if the shooting is connected to the 2 incidents on Sunday where 2 apartment buildings in the same area were struck by gunfire. The building hit on Wednesday was not the same as the 2 struck over the weekend. Police spokesperson Shannon Eames wrote in an emailed statement. And I must end now with you've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the August 27 issue of the Toronto Star. Your reader has been Jane. Thank you for listening.